Good afternoon, everyone. It's Gary Sly in the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It's kind of a dreary, cloudy October the 27th afternoon here in Leesburg, Florida. Got a book I want to review for you today and talk about a couple nice themes that emerged for me from the book. As I said, it's a dreary kind of a Monday afternoon here. There's a hurricane. Hurricane Melissa is churning around out in the Caribbean. We're not necessarily expecting to bear the brunt of the hurricane here, but from what we're hearing on the news, it's a very powerful one, and we certainly hope the best for folks in Jamaica and other places that might be in the path of that storm. We did have some pretty heavy flooding here in Central Florida yesterday as a result of that storm, I think. Areas of Mount Dora and Eustis here in Central Florida got some pretty bad rain. The record yesterday in Eustis was 20 inches of rain falling in a few hours. So we also want to extend our concern to those folks as well. But here in downtown Leesburg, we just had a lot of heavy rain, and it looks like we've got another rainstorm coming. So that's your weather update. Halloween is coming up, and I've got another big stitching retreat coming up on November the 1st. First, I want to talk a little bit about a book that I received. I guess I'm lucky now. I get books from publishers that I'm able to read and review and share with my viewers and hopefully get you interested in them. And this is one that just kind of showed up in the mail. It's called With Her Own Hands, Women Weaving Their Stories, and the author is Nicole Nerig. Fascinating book. Lots of wonderful, in-depth stories of women for whom textiles or fabric or fiber is an integral part kind of their survival and of their progress and of their moving forward. Doesn't surprise me. I talk about a lot about the importance of all sorts of handmade traditions, but specifically when we talk about women and we talk about the use of spinning and fiber and weaving and all those things that have come down through history, it's certainly important. And what Nerig does is kind of trace different ways that women have kind of grasped on to fiber traditions and use those to extend their own power, to give themselves a voice in the world, to express creativity, sometimes even to enhance their very survival. What it did is it made me kind of take a second look at a couple things that I've talked about before, but really gave me a very different perspective on them. The first is the whole tradition of crazy quilts, and I need to keep my notes up here where I can see them. Back in Flosstube number 45, you'll see a wonderful interview I did with my friend Sally Criswell. She is kind of a local expert on the crazy quilt and all the sorts of embellishments and stitches and techniques that are involved in crazy quilting. But I'm not even sure Sally knows as much about the history of it as what I was able to find here. What Nerig argues in terms of crazy quilts, which was a phase that attracted American women beginning in the 1880s. What Nerig argues is that crazy quilts were a way for women in that very strict Victorian age to kind of bust the seams and break out of the quaint little restricted kind of traditions that they had received from their own foremothers in terms of stitching. Now, if you know crazy quilts, you know that the word is very apt. They are full of color and crazy embroidery stitches. This is a wonderful piece, actually, that belongs to Sally Criswell that is for sale here in the shop. It even has embellished in it a tintype of a family. And you can just see as I hold it up and kind of pass it along in front of the camera how many different kinds of stitches and styles and colors and all that. When we think of the Victorian age, we tend to think, as I said earlier, of a very kind of constricted, very orderly, very moderate kind of life. And I guess I never really thought about it before, but it is kind of a conundrum that something like a crazy quilt emerges from that same period. What Narig does in the book is she traces one particular woman who understood and did crazy quilting in her own lifetime. Her name is Ruth McInerney Stewart. And during the time she was doing crazy quilts, she was the wife of a slave owner on a plantation in Louisiana. But eventually, Ruth's husband died. She fell into hard times, lost the plantation and all that, and eventually moved to New York City and became a writer. So obviously, because of kind of the transition that happened to her life, she was able to look back at the period of when she was doing the crazy quilts and kind of assess them in a different way. And I think it's pretty clear if you look at her own writings that she saw the crazy quilt in its day as a way to rebel against the restrictions that were placed on women, particularly women in the South, in the slave-owning kind of areas where she lived. She wrote a letter to her crazy quilt, and I don't have pictures of the quilt itself, but she wrote a letter to it, and I'll just read that. It says, "Yes, I suppose you continue to be beautiful, my quilt, even after the day of the ordinary crazy quilt phase is past. The truth is, I put my best self into you. You were to me, before I waked from the delusion, my one poem, the first form in which something within me seemed to find full expression." So as I say, Ruth went on to use her literary skills to be a writer in New York City, and she was very far removed from that plantation life in Louisiana where she created crazy quilts. But it casts a very interesting perspective on the whole idea of crazy quilts. They're an act of rebellion. They're an act of a woman being able, even though she might not have had the voice to speak and express herself openly in the society around her, could take a needle and thread and do so through the crazy quilt. So it really is a fascinating kind of little period there. Now, crazy quilts had their renaissance during that period from 1880 up until the early part of the 20th century, fell into kind of disuse and now are quite popular again, and people have begun to find different ways of using crazy quilts. And I don't know that they have the same connotations of resistance and creativity that they did then, but it's kind of fun to know that part of the history. I will say that Sally Criswell is going to come down here to Leesburg in April, and we're going to plan a big crazy quilt day here. You know, I've been doing some retreats across the street at the church. Well, we're going to have a big crazy quilt day, and there are going to be some projects that people are going to do to replicate crazy quilt skills. Sally will do a lecture on the history of crazy quilts. So if it's something you're interested in, I'll be posting pretty soon some information on that. I believe it's the third Saturday in April. But it'll be on my webpage, GaryLeeSly.com. And if that's something you're interested in, you really want to find out more about crazy quilts, we're going to dedicate a whole day to them here. And I'll keep reading and trying to find out what I can about them in the meantime. So that's one of just dozens of stories that Nicole Narig gets into in this book with her own hands. Another one that really caught my attention, because back in my Flosstube number 44, I introduced you to Tattree's embroidery and did a bit of an overview of different themes and styles related to that. Tattree's embroidery is a tradition that goes back I find now in reading Nicole's book, over 3,000 years. So Palestinian women in one form or another have been doing tatrees embroidery for that long. Now at glance, it looks very much like traditional cross stitch that you might see somebody being working on today. What I found out in reading a little more closely in terms of the book is that it is done slightly different. This kind of cross stitch is done using waste fabric, no hoop involved, just putting waste fabric on top of whatever fabric you're going to be stitching on, doing your stitching and then pulling the waste fibers out. Probably some of you are familiar with using waste fiber, but that seems to be the way this cross stitch is accomplished pretty much across the board. So I have a number of nice pieces here that a friend of mine shared with me and that I've had for sale here in the shop for quite some time that represent tatrees embroidery. And of course, the different colors, the different motifs represent different aspects of Palestinian culture. But here's the level that the book takes it to that pushes it a little bit further. I'm sure that you're all aware of conflict that goes on right now in Gaza between Palestinians and the Israeli state. Now, I'm not going to try to get into the politics of who's right and who's wrong with all that, but certainly we know when we look at the history of that region that Palestinians and the Jewish people both have very strong ties to the land there. And the Palestinian people feel that they have been uprooted and moved away from their homelands. This tatrees embroidery takes on a special significance for Palestinian women because it's a way for them to maintain that cultural identity. And my friend tells me that these products were actually made in concentration camps, refugee camps. Concentration is a little strong, but refugee camps, not always inside the Palestinian territory, but in some of the countries that surround there where refugees are living. So the circumstances of their making and of their passing along this tradition are quite difficult. But from what I read and from what Nicole Nerig's research tells us, it's a vital piece of self-identity for Palestinian women. They feel it's very important to pass it along to their children and their grandchildren. I mean, think about a tradition that's 3,000 years old. I can't think of too many objects in my everyday life that I can say that I could trace back that far. Even, I mean, not to suggest that this work or any current embroidery is itself 3,000 years old, but the tradition, the cultural identity that goes with it goes back that far. There have even been times, and I suspect some of that's the case even now, in Gaza and other parts of former Palestinian territories where more traditional signs of resistance are not allowed. Palestinian flags, representations of the Intifada and different kinds of resistance symbols have at various times been banned in those territories because they're seen as a way to kind of foment revolution and create violence. But the women, in their own subtle way, behind the scenes, perhaps in ways that larger media and things like that wouldn't even notice, continued to create tatrees as a way of asserting their identity. So you could see tatrees embroidery as a bit of a resistance, as a way for women in a society where women typically don't have much voice, using traditions that maybe the male society don't pay much attention to anyway, and continuing to create imagery and pass along cultural tradition. So tatrees could be seen as a peaceful way of resisting. So those two images and those two stories are a good example of what you find throughout With Her Own Hands, Women Weaving Their Stories. It digs into weaving and fiber art all over the world and talks about some of the ingenious ways that women have used it to further their own purposes, to express their creativity, to assert their independence. Not to suggest that men are not an important part of fiber tradition. I certainly hope that's the case. But I think it's very fitting that this book specifically deals with women's stories and the important contributions that fiber and fabric have made to that. So many of the words we use in our language when we talk about weaving stories go back to the traditions of weaving and spinning. Spinning a tale is another phrase that you will hear. If you stop and think about it, a whole lot of the little idioms and language that reflects our culture still ties back to the times when we were doing hand weaving and hand spinning and all the other kinds of aspects of fiber that created the fabric of daily life prior to the Industrial Revolution. So I do recommend Nicole's book. I had a great time reading it. It's the kind of thing where you can sit down and read one little story, one little pericope of interest, and then kind of think about that and look around, do some research on that, go back, read another story, and find out more. So I don't do justice to the book. There are many, many wonderful stories here, but I do recommend it. Let's see who the publisher is. It's published, okay, I got it. It's published by Norton and Company, and the copyright is 2025. So it's very current, and it's something you can pick up today. That's it for this week. I'm gonna go walk up the street and go to the city commission meeting, see what they're up to today. Got a busy few weeks ahead, and we're only about a month away from Thanksgiving and the holidays now. So I hope the best for you and yours during this time. And as always, this is Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects.